It's my great pleasure to invite here on stage Greg Kidd. Greg Kidd is an old friend and a person who was the first investor in Twitter, Square, and advisor and investor in Ripple. He is a famous early-stage investor in fintech companies here in the Silicon Valley and internationally. Formerly, he was on the board of governors of the Federal Reserve in dealing with payments. Greg, welcome on stage. Our moderator is a dear person to me and to our SVOD conference, Galina Fedorova. She's an entrepreneur, a social innovator, and a philanthropist. She's a co-founder of Gooddler, an innovative technology for civic and charitable organizations working in humanitarian aid and development, disaster preparedness, and recovery. She's the president of Gooddler Foundation and co-founder of Social Impact Youth Summit. Galina is also a member of a strategic group of United Nations initiative, the Compact for Young People in Humanitarian Actions. Welcome on stage.
Thank you. Hello, Greg. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm sure a lot of people here are excited to see you. I saw already you've been talking to many fintech entrepreneurs around here, and I'm sure those in the audience will learn a lot. When Anna did the presentation, she mentioned portable identity, and she said that has a potential to change the world, but maybe some of the people in the audience don't even know what that really is. What is the portable identity?
Thank you for having me, and glad to be here today. So, portable identity means that if you have a name or identifier, it belongs to you. It's not issued by a company, it's not issued by a country, it's not issued by an industry. It means that whatever attestations about your identity, whatever holdings you have, oftentimes we talk about life and identity as identity being a bundle of sticks, the things that you have that nobody else has. And in a world of portable identity, you can take that with you and sign up or sign in or get permissions anywhere you go. Instead of identity being granted top down from an authority, it's something that you have bottom up.
Okay, I guess in a nutshell, it's not something that was given to you. What do you think, in Silicon Valley here, we talk a lot about innovation and a future of innovation, and especially in terms of identity. And we've heard that kids that are born today or in the later years would not even know what the actual driver license is. What do you think the future of identity as we know it right now, the paper document, is? Will we still have the paper document, or will it be something virtual, or how do you see it?
So there's types of innovation that are what I would call technology-based or good ideas, but sometimes the types of innovation that really change the world are things that come not so much from the head or are purely technical, but they're sort of a change of the way we feel or think about things. And sometimes the innovations are things like the way that the internet went from being something that was just for sort of geeky people to something that everyone could use. The main innovation that allowed that to happen was the creation of a namespace, the domain name system that meant that every website in the world had a unique name. There wasn't a Brazilian name or an Indian name, there was one namespace for the whole world. That concept, which is a linguistic concept, was the innovation that abstracted away the technical layer underneath. Now imagine if that could happen for identity, that at the top level of identity wasn't a number or some technology like a phone or a card, but just if every one of us had a unique name. It doesn't have to be your actual name. It could be a name like your Twitter handle or your Skype handle. There's only about 7 billion of us, so there's plenty of names to go around. Then independent of the technology, if I wanted to send you money or share the permission for my medical records or let you open a car door, just like you can send a message or a photo or a video between any two addresses on a messaging system, well, you ought to be able to send value or permissions name to name without having to think about the underlying technology. I shouldn't have to know about your accounts. You shouldn't have to know about mine. The routing is based on a linguistic concept. And so in that future, whatever attestations about your identity, how much I trust you, it could be things that are attached to you. It could be a biometric. It could be information off of a piece of paper. It could be information from people that are in your contact list. All of those things are just different markers of identity. You could collect them like Easter eggs, but instead of attaching them to a piece of technology like a phone or a card, you go the other way around. You put the person at the top. You tag them with something that's linguistically created, something that really is creative from us humans. We did create speech, and we have this concept of general identities and unique identities. And then you use all that technology, including the blockchain, to attach to that linguistic concept. And that, I think, is the future of identity rather than a piece of paper or a particular technology like a biometric.
Interesting that you mentioned this transfer of money to each other, and then obviously the next question comes, and I think a lot of people have that's the same question, and the startups that were pitching were asked about that. How about privacy? And your company claims that your approach can restore data privacy for individuals and expand actually access to financial services for the poor, while helping regulators at the same time and law enforcement to locate bad actors. Other organizations only see that happening through government regulations. If government said we are putting these barriers to catch the bad guys, what are your thoughts on the innovation in the slow changing, resistant to innovation sectors like banking?
Well, so sometimes people have two different dystopian visions of the future of the world. I call one is, on one side is George Orwell, that some authority controls everything. And on the other end is Mad Max, like what's total anarchy, crypto anarchy. I grew up in the era of Star Trek. And in Star Trek, even though there were like warring Romulans and Klingons and the Federation, and everybody was going around and having intergalactic war, there seemed to be a system that everybody could buy dilithium crystals. So even though there were warring galaxies, there was some sort of ledger system, an identity system that kept track of everybody's tokens. And it wasn't Orwellian, and it wasn't anarchy. Also, every planet they landed on, all the local natives all seemed to speak English. I don't know how they figured that out. But the point was there was a standard, whether it was a standard for language or a standard for credits. That system could be something that could work with a ledger for identity. We talked about the names, in which you could separate out the attestations about your identity, i.e. that you have a phone number, that you have a government ID, that you're over a certain age, from the actual underlying private information. So the actual private information as to where you live and exactly what your birthday, that does not often need to be known to satisfy the needs of a regulator or a law enforcement. They need to know that you're of age, and if something happens and there's a bomb that goes off, they could get to that private information. But unless there's a warrant, unless there's due process of law, you could create an identity system that has very strong attestations about the level of identity and trust that you have without giving up the underlying private information. And so the attestations about your identity, the things that people have said about you, the level of trust, that could all be on a public ledger without giving up any private information unless there was a need backed by due process of law in any particular legal jurisdiction that applies around the world.
And how far are we from that happening? So how far are we from this portable identity?
Well, I worked at the Fed and then at a group called Promontory, and we did a lot of the work on some of the biggest money laundering and terrorist financing schemes in the world. My first job for that company was like tracking down the money laundering for Pinochet and whatnot. The current systems, in terms of their effectiveness for money laundering, their protection of privacy, we've seen what's happened with Facebook on the privacy front. So this concept of trusting Equifax or Facebook or big authorities with large honeypots of data, that hasn't worked out so well. And as far as the BSA AML regimes that are the current regulatory standard for the world, you really only catch with those the dumbest bad guys, right? It's really, really easy to beat those systems unless you're very clumsy and careless. And so if your standard is actually something that works, something that actually protects privacy and also creates security, the concept of trusting authorities that are running huge silos with honeypots of data is terrible for protecting privacy. It's also terrible for catching bad guys. So if we move toward an evidence-based of what actually works, I don't understand how the future works without something like portable identity that can cut across the silos and can protect privacy while giving enhanced opportunities for security. You do not have to trade off security against privacy if you design identity in a portable fashion.
Interesting. Since we are on this privacy thing, and you mentioned the Facebook, of course, there's been this frenzy about general data protection rule. Yeah. I think I got like millions of emails from everybody that I even forgot there was such an organization asking me to check their privacy rules. And what are your thoughts on that? So.
Yeah, I'm an avid cyclist. I read cycling news where I'm not even logged in, and I remember I got the GDPR notification, and I had to look at over 500 different sites that it was going to share my information with and make an individual decision as to on or off for each of those. Okay, that's one way you can think about the future, which is a very, very bushy way of thinking about it. I tend to think of those types of regulations, while they're good-hearted, like the things that all the labeling on food that tells us all the bad things that we shouldn't eat, that hasn't really helped deal with the problems of obesity and diabetes and stuff.
That's
so
right.
Simply giving people more information and a click-through accept, that type of terms of use are really what I call terms of abuse, right? Anytime you're in a situation where you have a contract and there's such unequal bargaining power between you and the thing you're going to do, that's not really a consensual activity between the two people. So simply creating more masses of information and disclosure doesn't actually increase the power of the individual in coping with the complexities of a top-down society and political system. So while I know GDPR is well-intentioned and Global ID is very compliant with it, I really do feel sorry because it really isn't helping solve the underlying issue, in my opinion.
Yeah, I also wanted you to touch on the subject of, I know we're going to have a separate panel and talking about financial inclusion, but I think portable identity and financial inclusion, there is this really good match, and it kind of goes hand in hand. And I wanted to tell all the entrepreneurs here, mission-driven entrepreneurs that are trying to reach the unbanked or underbanked, they do face the problem that once they get into the country, a lot of people have no documents, and even NGOs serving them don't really know who they serve. So how can your portable identity help in that setting? It's understandable here in the US how we can get that information, but how about those areas that are hard to reach?
Well, you look at places like India and Aadhaar, where in 5 months they signed up 250 million people for bank accounts. They didn't do it because they had government documents. They did it because they had a thumbprint or a retina scan. And so there are many, many different markers for identity. Probably the strongest marker for identity that really, if you want to catch bad guys, the way you find out who someone is you find out who they talk to. So if somebody has a mobile phone, even a feature phone, they probably have a contact list. And without actually getting all the private information, just getting the metadata of like how long that phone's been in use, who else you talk to. Is that enough information to like let somebody hold $200 worth of value attached to that phone number? I think so. Because why? Because did we catch Osama bin Laden by telling him he couldn't use the telephone? No, the way you catch bad guys is you look at the data. And what's the best data? What's the best metadata for figuring out who someone is? You find out who they talk to. I mean, how did they catch Osama bin Laden? They didn't catch him through the phone. They didn't catch him through the internet. They knew he wasn't using that. So they followed all the couriers going into and out of the country. That information leads to information that lets you solve crimes and problems. Mobile phones are a great form of identity. Biometrics are a great form of identity. So even in countries where you have weak government documents, poor penetration of formal banking, people still have phones. Even refugees, like one of my companies in Finland has given a card, payment card, to every single refugee in Finland. They've done the program through the government, because even if those folks show up with no documentation, you can start creating an identity. Just at Square, when we gave people their first merchant accounts, we didn't check their credit records because we found of our own employees, 40% of the folks couldn't even pass a credit check. So if our own employees couldn't pass, maybe we should throw out that method as a way of identifying which people are qualified enough to have an account. We just gave them low limits, and we used the data to learn. Just like Amazon and PayPal learned about fraud, not by like thinking it to death in a closet. They took people in, they gave them a chance to have experiences, including bad experiences, and they learned from that. You don't learn from getting everything right. You learn from having a certain amount of failure, so you can build a system that detects false positives from false negatives. You have to have people in the system. So when somebody asks, "But are you going to let bad guys into the system?" I'm like, yeah, that's how you catch them. If they're not in the system, you don't see what they're doing. And so that mentality, that thinking, and this is me speaking as an ex-regulator, is you need the data if you're going to catch the people. And so having an exclusionary system doesn't help you improve. And so you can, once again, work on the issues of regulatory and legal concern about bad actors and serve financial inclusion all at once if you design the system with those goals as your outputs.
Yeah, and I think people here in the audience, I'm sure most of us, or not all of us, probably don't even know a person who is unbanked or underbanked. We probably have tons of credit cards and know people with credit lines. And why should we even care about this financial inclusion? What is it in it for us?
Well, there's two things. There are people out there that don't have access to a stored value account. My gardener, undocumented immigrant, Rudy, he calls me Mr. Greg. He hasn't got this whole thing that's my first name, not my last name. I mean, you should see the look on his face when for the first time on his phone he could see a balance as opposed to taking a paper check, going down and paying a fee to cash it, and then paying another fee to send some of that money back to his mother in Guatemala. There is that group. The second thing is, yes, while we're all banked, the world the way it works today, when you want to send money and value from one person to another, and they're in this silo and they're in that silo, even like Venmo to PayPal, it's the same company, but there's no way to send it between the ledgers. The ledgers are stupidly trapped. And you can do things like interledger, and you can connect one ledger system to another technologically, but just because you've connected two ledgers and you can send money quickly technologically, it doesn't mean you should. That's what Ready, Fire, Aim is all about. Being able to send money quickly between ledgers isn't necessarily a good idea unless you have identity. And so part of this is just to actually, even for us that are all banked, we're banked in different places. I just landed from Kiev yesterday. I have like no way easily to pay those folks that I'm working with in Kiev. I met a team, also Poland, Czechoslovakia. We're all living in our different silos. And, maybe the world is becoming and going back to tribes, but I still believe in that Star Trek world where I ought to be able to send text messages and videos to anyone, but I ought to be able to send money as well. And it doesn't matter if you're a very wealthy, well-to-do person. It's still hard to move money around in this world. And there's no reason that moving value should be any harder than a text message or a video. I mean, when we started Twitter, We couldn't raise any money in Silicon Valley because all we did was send text messages back and forth. And the venture capitalists said, there's no technology to Twitter, right? We had to raise money on the East Coast because they got that it was a media company. But the interesting thing about Twitter, even though there was no technology, was because any phone could send or receive a tweet and everybody just needed a name to use it, it was global from the start. That's how we got the traction. So sometimes the focus on technology or optimizing a particular silo makes you answer the wrong question. And so, if I have one piece of advice, it's like, don't worry about getting the right answer, just make sure you're asking the right question. And then you might build something that's going to be interesting, even if you get it wrong the first couple of times, you're working on the right question.
Yeah, interesting. And since you mentioned Twitter, I think it's, we're all curious to know, what's your path has been? You got to Global ID right now. We know Anna mentioned you had Twitter and you had Ripple and on a way in other companies in between. Can you tell us how I think it would even show like maybe how your thinking goes. You started here and now you're here. What was in between?
Well, it's kind of like a Forrest Gump experience. You just kind of stumble into one thing. I mean, Jack Dorsey hacked into one of my early companies and I hired him sight unseen, and I never really understood what he was saying, but I always realized you should probably keep an extra bottle of milk in the refrigerator because I had a sense that that guy was going to nail it, right? The same thing with Twitter and Square were both pre-Satoshi in 2008, and Bitcoin was an amazing system, not to me so much technologically, although obviously it's a technological innovation. The great thing about Bitcoin to me was in a sector where I had been a regulator, you always had to ask permission to innovate in fintech and regtech. But with blockchain, look, it's not very efficient. It's slow, okay? It's not compliant. It doesn't have like cross liquidity, but it was an innovation where you did not have to ask permission in a sector where everybody always had to ask permission. And so the companies that came along, Bitcoin wasn't a company, so one of the first ones I could get involved with was Ripple. And Ripple was like another ledger, but it had two extra columns. One for currency, so instead of it just being one currency, it could be any currency, and two for the issuer. Who did you trust behind that currency? Now the only problem was when I showed up as I think about the 10th person as the chief risk officer, I was like, looked at this ledger and there were all these balances, and I want to go back to the first ledger, the Adam and Eve event, from 1 to 2 to 3 to, you see, well, we lost the first 40,000 ledgers, so we already had 188 users before we could keep track. And as a chief risk officer and someone with a compliance background, losing the first 40,000 ledgers and then finding that all identities henceforth were only an email address, that made me know I was not going to have a great meeting the first time I went to Washington, D.C. to meet with figures from Treasury to explain what this distributed ledger thing was all about. So distributed ledgers without identity, that's like, wow, we've got a blockchain for diamonds, and we've got one for like houses and cars and fine art. I'm like, that's all great, but if you don't know who's signing for the private keys, while that's a technically elegant solution, we live in a world of law and regulation, and that's totally not compliant. So it's really cool, but like my chance to be at Ripple was a chance to figure out whether we could take these technologies and bring them to the mainstream, because that's the part that's really exciting. I saw somebody else who mentioned something about abundance rather than disruption. Well, it's hard to have abundance if you're focusing on the 1% of people rather than the 99%. And so taking a new technology like blockchain, combining it with the advances that we have in biometrics or the abilities of mobile phones and GPS, and creating a system that isn't Orwellian and isn't Mad Max and touches everyone, that's why it's a really exciting time to be on the planet right now. And I'm really, really excited to be here. I'm a little bit jet lagged because I just got off from working with the teams overseas. And it is amazing that the talent in this area, I wish I could say this is a talent area that's led by Silicon Valley, That's not what I'm seeing. This is a talent area that's led by people from all over the world. I just come here because the weather's nice.
Yeah, and you just mentioned that you're creating the systems around the solutions that you have. And Gooddler Foundation is all about creating strategic alliances, and we create those strategic alliances to actually target certain problems that are difficult for one particular organizations to face. So here, there are a lot of entrepreneurs here, and for those who are listening to us, what kind of partnerships are you generally looking for? Who would be a perfect partner for your global ID? Who will move you forward, and who you can partner with that together you can progress?
So like one thing I did learn from Jack Dorsey, who was, we originally built this system for dispatching bike messenger jobs, and that's the company he hacked into. And we had hour jobs, we had motorcycle jobs, we had information about this geographical, that. We had all these different things, and we would dispatch that out with text messaging and radios. And we learned a lot from that about messaging and about payments. And when Twitter came along, Jack's idea was, we're just going to do 140 characters. And we go, well, what about like this metadata and that? He said, nope, we're just going to do 140 characters. Jack's key insight, always more insightful, more intuitive than me, was that less is more. And so it sounds like a strange thing, but if you want to have an ambition, you got to figure out like what not to do. So the thing that you do is more. And so one of my reasons for pushing the global ID piece is that I think that the problem of identity is not something that every other startup should have to solve again and again and again. So an identity platform is a horizontal. It doesn't matter whether you're working with medical records, unlocking car doors, or moving money. It doesn't matter if you have the most brilliant identity solution in the world. If it just works in that silo, it's not identity. It's something like identity, but it's just in a silo. Identity has got to be something that works at a horizontal level, because we don't live in a tribe anymore on an island. We live in a global world, and identity issues cut across. So anyone who's building an entrepreneurial venture, the things that you can figure out how not to do, because somebody like Stripe is going to handle cards, or X, Y, or Z, these other folks that can do these horizontals that free you up to do the thing you do at a level and a depth that's beyond, that's an amazing thing today, that you can do more by doing less. And so the disciplined founder that knows how to like identify that key thing that they're doing and figures out how to move everything else off the table, that's a passionate, insightful founder that I want to make sure there's milk in his refrigerator.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, and on a personal note, I'd like to touch on something that I think every entrepreneur in the audience could be interested in, is your resilience. So you are not a stranger to setbacks. Those who can Google your profile and bio would know that there's some, you had to push through and have energy to do so. So what would be your advice to entrepreneurs on how to persevere?
Well, the best stories are always about not things that went right. The best stories are always about things that went wrong. And so it is very difficult in certain other cultures where your setbacks and your failures are things that might be held against you for life. And there is, the one great thing about America is, you can make a great story about failure, and that's kind of like, still to me, the best thing about America. And so I wish right now, the thing that America is exporting to a lot of other places in the world I'm not so proud of, but that concept where it's okay to fail, and that's part of like experience. I just remember there was Ev Williams, who was the other co-founder of Twitter. The thing he'd done before Twitter was he built Blogger, sold that to Google. He was the guy that kind of built blogging. And I remember him just explaining himself to a bunch of investors that were coming, I guess it was Fred Wilson. But he very quickly just said, well, you know, I did this blogger thing, but everything else I did was basically a disaster. And if you wanted to hear about the disasters, he could tell about all the different ways he failed. But it's that thing, if you can talk about every failure as a lesson learned, that's pretty compelling. Because, you know, the gal or the guy that I want to back in the room, you know, is the one, they don't have to be old, they just have to have those battle scars. Because I think that's what learning is. I was really surprised by the earlier presentation about how the brain works and the exercise and the fact that that exercise is best when you go out there. You can think about all your failures as exercise. And then, you know, then you'll sleep better too.
Yeah, that's for sure. Yes, and I think that on this note we can end this discussion, and you'll be on the panel, so you'll have one more question for you. But yes, let's thank Greg for a great chat. Thank you.